The last words my wife ever spoke to me in court weren't about love, regret, or even goodbye. She leaned close, her diamond earrings flashing under the California sun, and whispered like a knife against my throat, "You're nothing without me." Then she walked out with Carl, my hunting buddy of 40 years, her arm linked in his as though the two of them had just buried me alive and were already on their way to celebrate. Before I take you further, let me ask you, have you ever been betrayed by the person you trusted most? Share your feelings in the comments below and let me know where you're watching from. And if you haven't yet, hit subscribe, because stories like this filled with scars and twists are what we share here. My name is George Whitman. I'm 66 years old, a retired carpenter. For 4 decades, I built homes, porches, church steeples, structures meant to withstand storms. I thought I had built a life just as solid. But that day on the courthouse steps, everything I believed in collapsed like rotten timber. Linda, my wife, had walked away with our $2.8 million Palm Springs villa, half my retirement, and the man I once trusted more than my own brother. I can still feel the heat rising off the courthouse pavement as I staggered into the parking lot, clutching a cardboard box stuffed with divorce papers. My hands shook so hard the sharp edges cut into my skin. Strangers passed by, lawyers, secretaries, people with places to be, while I stood frozen watching Linda's silk blazer disappear into the sunlight, Carl at her side. He used to sit beside me in duck blinds, passing me jerky and telling me stories about his kids. Now he carried her purse like he'd been rehearsing for it all along. I dragged myself to my '92 Chevy pickup, its paint peeling like old bark, the seats cracked, and smelling of oil and stale coffee. That truck was all I had left, along with a few battered tools no judge could take away. I turned the key. The engine coughed like a dying man before catching with a shudder. But I didn't drive home. What home? The villa was hers. The apartment I'd been renting felt like a punishment cell. Instead, I pointed the truck north the highway, stretching ahead, like a question with no answer. The farther I drove, the emptier I felt, like my chest was nothing but hollow beams. Her words looped in my head again and again. "You're nothing without me." Each time they hit harder, like hammer strikes against soft wood. 40 years of marriage, 40 years of sweat, sacrifice, loyalty, and in one afternoon it all signed away like it never mattered. That night I pulled into a lonely truck stop past midnight, leaned back against the torn vinyl seat, and stared at the flickering neon sign of a diner. My eyes burned. My chest ached, and for the first time in decades, I had no picture of what tomorrow might look like. But here's the thing about life. Sometimes it has to tear you down to the studs before you can see what's waiting behind the walls. And I had no idea that my next chapter would begin with a phone call from half a world away. The desert night had a way of swallowing sound. I sat hunched in the cab of my Chevy, windows fogged from my breath, the cracked vinyl seat pressing into my back. Outside, the truck stop was half asleep, fluorescent lights buzzing, a lone semi idling in the distance, and the faint hum of a vending machine spitting cold air. I pulled my jacket tighter around my shoulders, but the chill that gnawed at me wasn't from the weather. It was the kind that comes when the world tells you you're finished, and for the first time in 40 years you believe it. I must have dozed off, curled against the steering wheel, because the sound startled me, sharp, insistent, slicing through the stillness. My phone. An unknown number glowed on the cracked screen. Midnight calls never bring good news. My first thought was Linda. Maybe she wanted to twist the knife deeper, gloat about champagne with Carl in the Palm Springs villa. I almost let it ring out. But something, curiosity instinct, maybe just stubbornness, made me swipe my thumb across the glass. "Mr. Whitman." The voice was calm, measured, carrying an accent I couldn't quite place at first. European, clipped and precise. "Yes," I croaked, my throat dry. "Who's asking?" "This is Matthias Keller with Gallon Private Banking Group in Zurich. We've been trying to reach you for quite some time." I blinked hard, certain I'd misheard. Zurich Banking Group. My entire life's savings had just been carved up by a judge. What could a Swiss banker possibly want with me? "You have the wrong man," I said, half ready to hang up. "No, Mr. Whitman," he replied, unshaken. "We believe you are the listed beneficiary of an account belonging to Edgar Whitman. Does that name mean anything to you?" The name hit me like a beam of light through fog. Edgar, my father's older brother. He'd vanished decades ago, the family's mystery. A soldier in his youth, a traveler later, he'd drifted into Europe and never returned. My father spoke of him rarely, always with a hint of bitterness, as though Edgar had chosen adventure over blood. I hadn't heard his name in 20 years. I knew him, but he disappeared. "Why are you calling me?" "Because," Mr. Whitman, Keller said, pausing, as though weighing each word, "you are the sole heir to his dormant account. The balance as of this evening's report exceeds $52 million US. I gripped the steering wheel with both hands, knuckles white. 52 million. The number didn't fit inside my head. It was too large, too unreal, especially for a man who had just lost everything down to his dignity. "You're joking," I whispered. "I assure you this is no joke. Your uncle left explicit instructions. The funds were to remain untouched until one condition was met." "What condition?" My voice cracked, suspicion mixing with disbelief. "That you were no longer legally bound by marriage." The words slid into me like ice water. Divorce. The one thing that had gutted me hours ago was the very key that unlocked this hidden fortune. Edgar had not trusted Linda. He'd planned for this day, waiting until my life was stripped bare before revealing what he had set aside. I sat there, the phone pressed against my ear, the neon glow bleeding through the windshield, my mind tumbling between rage, relief, and disbelief. $52 million waiting for a man who couldn't even scrape together first month's rent for a new place. "Why? Why now?" I asked. "Because your uncle believed freedom has a price," Keller answered gently. "He wanted you to be unbound before you remembered who you are." I closed my eyes. For years I had swung hammers, lifted beams, built foundations that lasted longer than I thought my marriage ever would. And now, sitting in a broken-down truck at a gas station in Nevada, I learned that my worth, at least in numbers, was more than I had ever dreamed. But it wasn't the money that made my chest tighten. It was the realization that life had twisted in a way I couldn't ignore. I had been torn down to nothing so that a door locked for decades could finally creak open. And for the first time since walking out of that courthouse, I felt something I hadn't dared to feel in months, hope. The line went dead, but Keller's words stayed with me like an echo I couldn't silence. $52 million locked away until I was free of Linda. Free. The irony hit me like a brick. I leaned back in that truck cab, staring at the cracked ceiling liner, and my mind slid backward, not to Zurich, not to banks or numbers, but to the life that had led me here. I saw us again. Me and Linda, 35 years younger, squeezed into a one-bedroom apartment in Ohio with peeling wallpaper and a second-hand couch that sagged in the middle. We ate ramen noodles from chipped bowls, counted quarters to pay the electric bill, and swore that someday things would be different. She used to laugh when I came home from construction sites covered in dust, drop my boots at the door, and fall onto that couch beside her. She'd curl up under my arm, whispering about houses we'd own, vacations we'd take, the future we'd build together. I believed every word. Back then, I took any job I could find, digging foundations, framing walls, patching roofs in the dead of winter. My hands bled, my back ached, but I didn't complain. Hard work was all I knew. And slowly the jobs grew. Word spread about the kid who showed up early, stayed late, and never cut corners. One year I scraped enough together to start my own small crew. That was the year we bought our first real home, a fixer-upper with drafty windows and a yard full of weeds. To us, it was a castle. Rebecca was born not long after. I still remember the way she gripped my finger, her tiny fist, stubborn and strong. Nights were long, Linda studying for her nursing license, me rocking Rebecca in the kitchen, while the smell of sawdust clung to my clothes. But we were a team then. Tired broke, but together. Somewhere along the line, success crept in. I landed bigger contracts, city projects, that doubled my income. I surprised Linda with the Palm Springs villa, believing I'd given her the dream she always talked about. But dreams change. Or maybe people do. Linda began spending less time at home, more at the country club. Her laugh shifted sharper, more polished, the kind you hear at wine tastings, where the bottles cost more than a month's rent. She traded evenings at our kitchen table for charity galas and board meetings where I never felt welcome. I chalked it up to growth. People grow, I told myself. Maybe I just needed to catch up. And then there was Carl. God, Carl. We hunted deer together in the frost of November, sat shoulder to shoulder, in duck blinds, past flasks under starry skies. He was there when my father died, holding my mother's hand at the funeral when I couldn't. He wasn't just my friend. He was my brother, in everything but blood. I never questioned his presence, never doubted his loyalty. But the distance between me and Linda widened, and Carl somehow filled that gap. At first I ignored the signs, late nights, whispered phone calls, excuses that sounded too rehearsed. Rebecca noticed before I did. She was 30 by then, sharp-eyed, carrying her mother's wit, but my stubborn streak. One night she sat across from me at the kitchen table, her voice low, careful. "Dad, something's not right. Mom's different. And Carl, he's around too much." I waved her off, told her she was overthinking. I couldn't bear the thought. I clung to the idea that hard work could fix anything, that if I built enough, earned enough, proved enough, Linda would see me again. But she never did. Looking back now, it wasn't the moment I caught them together that shattered me. It was the slow erosion, the nights she didn't come home, the look in Rebecca's eyes when she realized she couldn't protect me from the truth. The foundation had been cracking for years. I just refused to see it. And that's what burned the most. I had built houses meant to outlast storms, but I couldn't stop the walls of my own life from caving in. The cracks in my marriage became a canyon, and soon enough the papers arrived, heavy cream envelopes stamped with Linda's lawyer's crest. It felt less like a petition and more like a death sentence. By the time I stood in court, I wasn't just fighting for property or money. I was fighting for the dignity of a life I had built nail by nail. Linda didn't come alone. She came armed. Her attorney was a man from Los Angeles, polished like glass, with a smile too white to be honest. He called himself Donovan, but everyone in the room seemed to already know his reputation, ruthless, theatrical, a man who could turn saints into villains with nothing more than a few carefully chosen words. And I was his target. From the very first hearing, they painted me as something I barely recognized, an angry, outdated old man who clung to the past. Donovan's voice rang through the courtroom as he described me as controlling, rigid, unable to adapt. He flipped through pages of my financial records, pulling out the worst years, making it look like I had hidden money I never even saw. Every scar on my past, every mistake I'd made as a small business owner during recessions was twisted into a weapon. The hardest blows didn't come from strangers, though. They came from men I once called colleagues. 2 subcontractors I'd worked with years earlier, men I thought had long buried their grudges, showed up on the witness stand. They claimed I'd shorted them on jobs mistreated workers cut corners. Lies, half-truths, bitterness dressed as testimony, but the court didn't know the difference. Their words carried more weight than my decades of honest work. And through it all, Linda sat there like marble, not a flicker of emotion. Black dress hair pinned back, legs crossed. She could have been at a fashion show, not the trial that was tearing apart 40 years of marriage. When Donovan praised her resilience, she tilted her head slightly, almost smiling. I'd never felt so small. Rebecca tried. God, she tried. My daughter sat on that witness stand, her voice trembling but steady, trying to tell the court how her mother had changed, how she'd drifted away into clubs and charities while I stayed home fixing what was broken. Rebecca's eyes found mine, begging the judge to see me, as she did not perfect, but devoted loyal a man who worked himself raw for his family. But Donovan cut her down, too. Of course, you love your father, he said smoothly. But love does not erase neglect. Love doesn't mean he was present. He made her feel like a child, clinging to memories, not a grown woman speaking truth. When she stepped down, she wouldn't meet my eyes. I wanted to tell her she did enough, more than enough. But the gavel hadn't fallen yet, and we both knew the storm wasn't finished. 9 months. That's how long the battle dragged on. Hearing after hearing, motion after motion, until I was worn thin as old lumber. Then came the ruling. The villa hers. Half my retirement, the savings I thought would see me through my final years, hers. The only things left in my name were the tools in my workshop back in Ohio, a building barely big enough to store them, and my pickup truck that coughed more than it ran. When the judge read the decision, I didn't feel rage. I didn't even feel grief. I felt hollow, like the court had scooped me out and left nothing but a shell. I looked at Linda one last time. She didn't cry. She didn't thank me for the years we shared. She leaned in close as she passed by and whispered calm and sharp as ever I told you. You're nothing without me. Those words didn't just close the case. They buried the man I thought I was, and for weeks after I believed her. After the gavel fell, and Linda's words sank into me like poison, I spent weeks drifting through days that didn't seem to belong to me. But the midnight call from Zurich never left my mind. It was the only spark in the darkness, the only thread pulling me forward. So, when Keller's office arranged the ticket, I packed the little I had left, 2 shirts, a worn wallet, my father's old watch, and boarded a plane bound for Switzerland. The flight felt unreal. I hadn't been overseas since my honeymoon in Mexico decades earlier, when Linda still laughed at my corny jokes and clung to my arm like she'd never let go. Now, I was alone, a hollow man in a middle seat, staring at clouds that looked softer than anything I'd felt in years. I told myself not to believe too quickly. Maybe this was a scam. Maybe fate was just playing another cruel trick. But something inside whispered, go. Find out. Zurich greeted me with cold gray skies and streets polished like glass. At the arrivals hall, a driver in a black suit held up a card with my name, Mr. George Whitman, written in neat ink. He didn't make small talk, just drove me through a city of stone buildings and quiet power past Lake Zurich, shimmering under the morning light. The car finally stopped before an iron-gated building etched with gold letters Gallon, Private Banking Group. Inside, the air smelled of leather and polish. Heavy carpets muffled each step. I was led into a wood-paneled office that looked more like a library than a bank. Behind a wide desk sat a man in his early 60s with silver hair, calm eyes, and a voice I recognized from the call. "Mr. Whitman," he said, rising to shake my hand. "I'm Simon Keller. We've been waiting for you a long time." He poured coffee, strong and black, then slid a folder across the desk. Inside were documents, bank statements, and most startling of all, letters. My name written in a hand I remembered faintly from childhood birthdays. Edgar Whitman, my uncle, the ghost of the family. Simon explained what little he could. Edgar had been a decorated World War II veteran, later working in intelligence for the U.S. government. At some point in the 1960s, he had disappeared into Europe. The family whispered of scandal, of secrets of a man who traded duty for exile. But Edgar had never truly vanished. He had simply chosen another path, one shrouded in silence. "Your uncle was meticulous," Simon said, his voice steady. "He moved his assets across borders into trusts and accounts most people wouldn't even know existed. But he left instructions clear and precise. They all pointed to you." I unfolded the first letter. The paper was yellowed at the edges, the handwriting strong and deliberate. "George," it began, "if you are reading this, it means the chains that bound you have been cut. Freedom only comes when you are no longer tied to falsehood. I could not give this to you while she was at your side. I never trusted her, and I will not apologize for protecting you in silence." My hands trembled. The words felt both harsh and protective, like a man bracing me with tough love from beyond the grave. Another page listed assets I couldn't comprehend, not just the 52 million in securities and accounts, but a vineyard in the south of France, acres of sunlit vines Edgar had purchased decades earlier, and a sealed chest. A box of memories, Simon called it, containing Edgar's journals, medals, and what he cryptically labeled truths too heavy for a young man to bear. I sat there, the weight of it pressing on me. I had come to Zurich expecting numbers. Instead, I was handed a legacy. Money, yes, but also history unfinished, unresolved. My uncle hadn't simply left me wealth, he had left me a story, and perhaps a warning. When I finally signed the documents, the pen felt heavy in my hand. The fortune was mine, but it didn't feel like winning. It felt like inheriting a responsibility I didn't yet understand. For years, Linda's voice had haunted me. "You're nothing without me." Now, with Edgar's words in my hand, I realized she was wrong. I wasn't nothing. I just hadn't discovered what I truly was. Not yet. The letters from Edgar stayed with me long after I left Zurich. They weren't just words. They were a mirror, forcing me to look at myself, without the weight of Linda's shadow. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like a man who had been stripped bare. I felt like a man being asked to begin again. So I booked my flight home, not to Palm Springs, not to Ohio, but to somewhere I had never been before. Somewhere I could carve out a life with my own hands, free of ghosts. That's how I ended up in Tennessee, on a stretch of land just outside Nashville. The ranch house wasn't grand, one story, weathered siding a wraparound porch that creaked when you stepped on it. But when I walked the property line, boots crunching on gravel, I felt something I hadn't in years, peace. The air smelled of honeysuckle and fresh hay. The sky at night stretched wide enough to swallow every regret I carried. It wasn't a mansion, but it was mine. Rebecca visited the first weekend. She pulled up in her SUV with her 2 kids tumbling out of the back, racing toward the fields like they'd been waiting their whole lives to run free. My daughter hugged me hard, longer than she ever had before. "Dad," she whispered, This place feels like home already. Hearing her say that after everything she'd endured caught between parents at war, it meant more than any bank statement in Zurich ever could. I threw myself into the work. It wasn't about building for profit anymore. It was about building for life. I repaired the porch boards, cut lumber for a new barn, and hammered together a chicken coop that leaned a little but held steady against the wind. My hands found their rhythm again, calluses thickening shoulders, aching the way they used to in the early days. I planted rows of tomatoes and beans, turned the soil, until sweat ran into my eyes, and for the first time in decades, the labor didn't feel like survival. It felt like healing. It was during one of those evenings when the sky burned orange and the cicadas started their song that I met Martha. She lived on the next property over a widow with silver hair pulled back in a braid and eyes that had clearly seen their share of storms. She brought over a basket of cornbread and jam, saying she thought I might not have unpacked my kitchen yet. She was right. We sat on the porch swing that night, the boards groaning beneath us, sipping coffee, while the crickets filled the silence. She didn't pry, didn't ask for details about my past. She just listened, nodding at the pieces I offered, filling the spaces with stories of her own. How she lost her husband 3 years earlier, how she kept her garden alive, even when grief nearly killed her spirit. For the first time, I felt seen not as a man who lost, but as a man who had endured. Days turned into weeks, and I realized I no longer woke up with Linda's voice echoing in my head. Instead, I woke to the sound of roosters, the smell of coffee, and the laughter of my grandchildren when they visited on weekends. Martha's presence became a steady comfort, a reminder that life had chapters left to write, even when the earlier ones ended in fire. The ranch wasn't polished, and neither was I, but both of us were honest. And in that honesty, I found something I'd been missing all along, a kind of peace that no court could grant, no betrayal could steal, and no amount of money could buy. Life on the ranch had a rhythm, steady and quiet, the kind of rhythm my heart had been starving for. I woke with the sun, worked with my hands, and ended my evenings on the porch swing, listening to Martha hum old country tunes. The silence no longer felt empty. It felt earned. But peace has a way of drawing out the ghosts, as if they can't stand being left behind. The first ghost came in the form of a phone call. I didn't recognize the number, but I answered anyway, thinking it might be Rebecca. Instead, Linda's voice spilled through the receiver, cracked and trembling. "George, it's me." For a moment I said nothing. My chest tightened at the sound of her. Memories rushed in, good ones, bad ones, all tangled like wires, sparking in the dark. "I made a mistake," she whispered, her breath hitching. "I never stopped loving you. I was angry, confused. Carl, he doesn't mean anything. I want to come home. We can start over." Her words might have once broken me wide open. Now they rang hollow like echoes bouncing around an empty church. I looked out over the pasture, where the evening light painted everything gold. Home. That word didn't belong to her anymore. "I think you should hang up now," I said quietly. She sobbed, begged, pleaded, but my hand was steady as I pressed the button to end the call. A week later, another ghost arrived, this time in ink. A letter slid into my mailbox, the handwriting familiar in a way that made my stomach twist. Carl. George. I messed up. Things got complicated. I should have been honest. I should have remembered what you meant to me. I don't expect forgiveness, but I need to see you man to man. Just once. I stood in the kitchen, the paper trembling in my hands. Carl, the man who'd stood by me when my father died, the man I once trusted more than blood, and now he wanted what closure absolution. I crumpled the letter, tossed it into the trash, and whispered to the empty room, "You had your chance." The truth is, their return didn't surprise me. People often circle back when the shine wears off their choices, when the consequences finally outlast the thrill. But I wasn't the same man they'd left behind. The man who begged for scraps of love, who ignored the cracks. Until the whole house caved in, that man was gone. One evening, sitting on the porch with Martha, I told her about the calls and the letter. She didn't say much, just reached over and set her hand on mine. Her touch was warm, steady, alive. That simple gesture spoke louder than all of Linda's pleas and Carl's apologies combined. I realized then that the greatest freedom wasn't in Edgar's millions, or even in the land beneath my boots. It was in the choice to finally close the door on a past that had bled me dry. I had wasted too many years believing my worth came from being a husband, a provider, a friend to people who only loved me for what I gave them. Standing there looking out at the ranch I built with my own hands, I understood my value wasn't theirs to decide. I lost a lifetime figuring this out, I said softly, almost to myself. But my worth doesn't live in anyone else's hands. And with that, the ghosts lost their grip. I didn't need revenge. I didn't need apologies. I needed peace. And I finally had it. After the calls from Linda and Carl faded into silence, I thought my story might end in peace and solitude. But peace, I learned, isn't just something you hold, it's something you can pass on. And the truth was, I couldn't shake the memory of that night I slept in my truck outside the gas station, the cold vinyl seat biting into my back, the taste of despair thick in my throat. No man should have to feel that alone, especially after giving so much of himself to family, to work, to life. So, I made a decision. I took part of Edgar's inheritance and started something I called the Whitman Foundation. Its purpose was simple: to help men like me, middle-aged or older, blindsided by divorce or loss, find a roof over their heads when the world stripped them bare. Temporary housing, job training, even just a warm meal and someone to listen. It wasn't charity. It was a lifeline. A promise that no one would have to curl up in the back of a truck wondering if they were worth anything at all. When I told Rebecca about it, her eyes filled with tears. "Dad," she said, "you don't just rebuild houses. You rebuild people." She hugged me tighter than she had since she was a little girl. I felt her pride in my chest, heavy and real, the kind of pride no courtroom could ever take away. Word spread slowly at first. An article in the local paper, then a segment on the evening news. Men started showing up carrying nothing but duffel bags and stories that sounded too much like mine. One had been thrown out by his wife after 30 years. Another had lost everything in a bitter custody battle. They came in broken shoulders, hunched, eyes hollow. And little by little, I watched them straighten, watched the light return. I worked alongside them, hammering nails, sanding boards, fixing what was broken. The smell of fresh wood and sawdust became my church. And every time a man picked up a tool, every time someone walked into one of our shelters, instead of sleeping in a car, I felt Edgar's hand on my shoulder, steady and proud. Maybe this was his plan all along, not to make me rich, but to make me whole enough to help others. One evening, Rebecca brought her kids over to the ranch. The air was warm, the sky brushed with pink and lavender. My grandchildren chased each other across the yard, their laughter rising like music. Rebecca sat on the porch rail, guitar in hand, strumming, while Martha and I watched from the swing. For the first time, I realized my life wasn't defined by what I lost, but by what I had left. As the sun sank low, I thought about Edgar's words, about Linda's poison, about the nights I thought I'd never climb out of the hole I'd been thrown into. And I whispered to myself, money can't buy back youth. But it can buy the chance to live the rest of your life in truth. That's all I ever wanted. Not revenge, not grandeur, just honesty. A place where the silence wasn't heavy, but holy. The camera of memory closes on that porch. Me with a cup of coffee in my hand, the kids' laughter drifting on the breeze, Martha humming beside me. No diamonds, no courtrooms, no mansions, just wood, earth, and peace. And for the first time in decades, I smiled and knew this was enough.